What else influences the way you make decisions? Well, there are a number of irrational habits and biases, particularly identified in the psychology literature. You just need to start to reflect on your own life. How do you explain those times when you've been involved in impulsive spending, for example, or trusting the wrong people, or fail to see the other person's point of view? No, just me then. How about when you succumb to temptations? There's a range of things there in everyday experience that we would have all experienced from time to time. Do we stop and really look for explanations as to why we do what actually, on the surface, looks to be pretty irrational at times? Well, it's largely because there's a series of biases that end up exerting an influence on us that we buy into. And this is another area that's been studied that helps us to think about how and why we make decisions. I'll start off by thinking, first of all, about confirmation bias. This is, as you'll see from the slide, cognitive ease. What we do is we just look for the information that confirms what we already think, what we already believe. We search for that evidence, but we already have some existing beliefs that we feel wedded to. We feel quite strongly about them. So we'll feel even more strongly. We'll actually feel nice about ourselves if we draw in information that just confirms. Yeah, you're right. I'm right. It feels good. The trouble is that within this notion of confirmation bias, we can focus too much on what are quite odd, different, or even unusual situations. We place too much weight on the probability of unlikely events actually happening. We overestimate rare events. So there's a danger, and I'll come back to it later, I'm sure, that within circumstances where something goes wrong and inquiries are held, that the amount of attention, publicity perhaps, that's given to those particular events almost blows them out of proportion. That it feels like they're the norm rather than the rare event itself. So this notion of confirmation bias, it's actually where I found from some of the literature, it was really tested out, worryingly so to a certain degree. There was a particular test involving intelligence services in the United States a number of years back. An exercise was conducted, a deliberate exercise. It was set up in the classroom, bringing together 12 people. As it turns out, 8 of them were terrorism analysts, people whose whole job is there to be analysing information about the potential of terrorist activities taking place. But there was also 4 complete novices who don't do that kind of work at all. Then as a group of 12, they were given a whole series of information, gradually accumulated information about people, about situations, about events, about places. And ultimately, they were being asked to determine who was the most likely to be the perpetrator of a terrorist event. Why I said at the beginning it's kind of a bit worrying is that only 1 out of the 12 people got the right answer at the end. And yet, you've guessed it, it was one of the 4 novices. None of the 8 experts got the answer right. Worrying maybe, but again, the importance of these kinds of exercises is at least it allows us to identify that confirmation biases exist and have a potential to strongly influence our thinking, whoever we are and whatever our role. That it's very important, it even affects experts. And if we know it's there, then we can train people to be more aware of it, manage it out of their thinking, manage it out of the situation a bit more. That was a good exercise that was put together to really bring home the fact that confirmation bias will influence even so-called experts in their specific area of expertise. Then there's our old friend hindsight bias. This is an interesting one for me in terms of the number of times I'm working with teams and groups of practitioners and we're thinking about those rare events when something has gone wrong, the decision has gone wrong, and inquiries are being held. All of a sudden, all of these experts come out of the woodwork, and keep in mind they're only experts because, as it says on the slide there, they're analysing the situation and in the knowledge of what the outcome was, with the benefit of hindsight. Well, I have to say, we're all experts when we look at something in hindsight. That's one of the dangers that we need to be aware of, the bias that actually creates contradictions of what we originally were working with and seeing. So in terms of all being experts, let's give some thought to, I suppose it is one of those fears that plagues so many practitioners, the fear that something will go wrong, and as a result of hindsight, blame will be apportioned. It does become all too easy to claim that their decision must have been failed decisions of sorts. Well, what we see, the danger of this hindsight bias from the slide there, is it shifts the attention away from the quality of the process, the quality of the thinking, the quality of the structure that goes into the thinking of a decision. And it shifts the attention away to concerns for possible outcomes, particularly negative outcomes. Again, it echoes what I was saying earlier, that we focus more on the fear of things going wrong than we do on our abilities to get things right. That can't necessarily in all situations be the best way of thinking, the best way of approaching decisions. Our good friend Daniel Kahneman, again, is the person that reminds us on this slide that hindsight bias has not been very helpful to decision makers, because as a result, we're very quick to blame decision makers for what were good decisions, honest and truthful decisions that just happen to work out badly. And that will happen from time to time. But we'll still blame them for that. On the flip side, we give very little credit for successful decisions, things that went right, that appear obvious, but only after the fact, not obvious at the time when the decision was being made. At that point, it was probably quite a challenging, difficult decision. It only looks obvious afterwards. Success looks as though it just emerged because it was easy and straightforward to do. And that does present big problems for us because, again, one of the messages that emerges is that as a result of adopting this hindsight bias, one of the dangers is that we can end up just focusing more on bureaucratic approaches to decision making. And I'm never a great fan of the bureaucratic approach, the one size fits all. If we apply that, well, it creates many problems and distractions in its own way. Cognitive biases. Again, there's a whole range of things here that will tap into our irrational beliefs that become fixed in some kind of way. What we need to be thinking about is a whole range of different cognitive biases, ways that we think. The first one here is the idea of this concept of relativity. What that means basically is that when we focus in and we really like somebody, we tend to apply thoughts about everything around them as being equally as important. Ariely, I was trying to think of a person in the literature who has drawn a particular attention to these irrational influences. Well, Ariely talks about how, again, around this concept of relativity, we not only tend to compare things with one another that are really not that comparable, but we're also very good at avoiding comparing things that are actually not that easy to compare at all anyway. We avoid that difficulty. And in the literature, Ariely also identifies how, in terms of relative value, we put more focus on that than we do on absolute value in certain circumstances, and that explains why we buy particularly into the buy one, get one free offer that we see in supermarkets, even though quite often it's not something that we really want or even need. It's an irrational response, an emotional arousal that's been triggered in us by good marketers. The advertising industry being very good at feeding our perceptions, dressing things up, packaging things, marketing things in very smart ways with slick names, and then taking our money off us, charging for it. It's a kind of similar thing in health and social care services and a whole bunch of businesses that buy into their own jargon. And they'll focus very much around the kind of jargon that is important to them, that they understand, but it actually excludes other people. Then, if I focus on this law of similarity, and I'll go to Dan Gardner, whose wonderful book, Risk, the Science and Politics of Fear, was published back in 2009, has been referenced back in an earlier module. He talks about this idea of the law of similarity, giving as an example the phrase, if he looks like a lion, it is a lion. And again, it's that cognitive ease, going for the easiest route. It kind of vaguely looks like what I think it is, so therefore it is what I think it is. Alongside that goes the rule of typical things, also identified in some of the work and the writing by Dan Gardner, where we rely too much on our own assumptions. What we think is typical, and then we draw other things in to be categorized by us in the way that we typically see things. The halo effect, that's one again where we like a person and then we kind of project this feeling onto things more widely around them, or people around them, or things that are important to them just because we like them. But just because we like them doesn't necessarily mean that we should apply the same level of feelings to everything else around them, or other feelings or ideas that they hold. But we can fall into this trap where we create this kind of halo. Then there's the example rule. Again, going back to Dan Gardner, it's we increase our belief in the possibility of a catastrophe if we've just been involved in discussing, let's say, Chernobyl back in the 1980s in Ukraine, or Fukushima more recently in Japan. If we're involved in those kinds of discussions, then we're more likely to draw a conclusion that nuclear power is necessarily a bad thing. Likewise, if we've just been watching a disaster movie, we kind of believe much more in the likelihood of catastrophes happening for a day or two afterwards, because that's primarily what is there in our conscious thinking at the time. And last but not least, the influence of the herd. How many of us really are strong enough, confident enough to stand out against the overwhelming beliefs of a group of people around us? Or do we quite often, even though we kind of hold a sneaking suspicion, maybe an intuition that we should be thinking something slightly different, but because everybody else is thinking in the same way, maybe I should fall into line. Maybe I should follow. Maybe there is more rational reasoning behind what they're saying, and I should just adopt that. As I'll draw this particular presentation to a close, I invite you to reflect on how some of those habits and biases have influenced your thinking and the decision making perhaps of you and your colleagues. Then I also invite you to read the accompanying PDF documents in the resources in this module, the one entitled Decision Making Traps. And note down any particular ways you and your colleagues can think of in attempting to avoid falling into the kind of habits, the traps, the biases that I've just been outlining.